Okay, so I think it's going there. I'm just going to have to pause it, and then we'll start with the Mangalacharan prayers. There we go. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militum Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Siddhanto Palasara Nityarasikam Hang Sang Vilang Audaryakya Sudama Sevakadanam Vishrumbha Bhakti Pradam Yakya Yukti Vichakshanam Bhagavato Vaishishta Shakya Sada Vandehang Triparari Namakayating Sri Bhakti Vedantinam Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyeva cha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Ajanulambita bujao kanakavatatao sankhyo kamalaya taksho vishwambaro dvijavaro yuga dharma palo vande jagapriya karo karunavataro vande Shri Krishna chaitanya nityanando sohodito pushpavanto chit vande hang Shri Vande Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityanando Sahodito Godadaye Pushpavanto Chitro Shandotamo Nudo Vandeham Shri Ramakrishna Abhaya Charana Sukho Sukado Paramanando Sundaro Subalo Priyo Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Sri Gaudiya Guru Parampara Ki Jai. So yeah, welcome everybody in the present or the future, depending on when you're watching this. So today we're going to start a study of Bhagavad-Gita. And so you might want to put your seatbelts on because it might take a while because there's 700 verses or so of the Bhagavad-Gita. But we intend to treat it as a comprehensive study of the Gita, to really go deep into it, because there's so much in the Bhagavad-Gita that applies to every devotee at every stage, really, but especially us at the stage of sadhana, who are practicing, trying to become fully surrendered to Krishna, if you will. There's so much there in the Gita that we can take shelter of. So today we're going to start our first session, which is really going to be more of a introduction and kind of an overview of how we're approaching it. Because for the last 2.5 years now, I guess, we've been doing a similar study with our local community here in the UK. And it's been very nice to go a bit deeper into the Gita. And so I thought it would be good to adapt some of these sessions for the Tattva Vivek series, so we can keep going deeper into the text together. And, as you know, the Gita's, all these Shastras, they're ever deep. There's so much that can be derived from them. And I'm sure we can all share different realizations and understandings also. So the way we've approached it locally is we've been looking at different acharyas and contemporary Vaishnav commentaries to get a multifaceted understanding. Sometimes I found in my own studies, some points from a particular commentary will fill in a gap for me that may not have been so clear elsewhere. So I'll be repeating a synthesis, really, of these texts, drawing from some of what I consider to be the most essential points to draw from, especially with a view as to how we can practically apply some of these things in our own pursuit of Uttama Bhakti, or pure devotion. And so I'll be especially drawing from classes of our own Guru Maharaj, for example, that offers even more insight, like I say, along with other commentaries and so on. And so, as most of you will probably know, the Bhagavad Gita, it consists of 18 chapters. It's about 700 verses. the title is said to literally mean the song of God. So Krishna is there singing on the battlefield, if you will. So it's living knowledge, said to be alive, although spoken directly by Krishna around 5,000 years ago or so. It's living knowledge. It's knowledge that we can apply in our lives at any time. And we'll see how that is so as we go through the Gita, hopefully. It's eternal knowledge, and like I say, something we can practically apply in our own lives to especially assist with our spiritual progress. Although it's true, sometimes many other things can be derived from the Gita. There are so many different perspectives on the Gita. You'll find even these days, business coaches and life coaches, etc., can derive many things, because there are many things in the Gita that help us deal with the material world, for example. But obviously, our emphasis is especially going to be focused on how those things can assist us in our spiritual progress. So like I say, it does deal with everything from how to live, but also how to die. Locally, we've just started the 8th chapter, or we will be starting the 8th chapter in our next session. And a lot of the 8th chapter, Krishna speaks about how to die, and how to deal with death also. So it gives us so much wisdom and guidance in different areas of our life that all of us as humans have to face. And so, it can help with different things like even mental states, depression, fear, confusion, temptation, the whole spectrum of human frailties, if you will. But most importantly, it does provide spiritual nourishment. It helps revive our spiritual consciousness, if you will. And it gives us direction how we can walk towards reaching that highest peak, that highest reach, if you will, of human potentiality. Our Guru Maharaj, he often points out that the Gita, it speaks to us a lot really about the nature of being. What does it mean to be, and how does that play out? What is the nature of being? Because we're all beings, we all exist. But one way I especially like the way the Gita can be summed up, if we were to sum up the Gita in just a line, is you can really say that the Gita, it takes us from selfishness to selflessness. And so we'll see next time when we study the first few verses, for example, we can see how even selfishness is there in the first verses, for example. But getting ahead of ourselves there. But the Gita takes us from selfishness or self-centeredness to selflessness, and all those bits in between. So as you can imagine, 1 hour sessions will never give enough time to cover everything that can be derived from studying even one verse of the Gita in depth. It is ever deep. Sometimes we hear these things, and it might just sound like promotional marketing for our particular religious book, if you will, or spiritual book. But it really does. If you've ever taken the time to read the Gita, study the Gita, classes on the Gita, and so on, it offers new insights all the time. I can certainly attest to that, and I'm sure most of you can also, if not all of you. So even there's a nice verse at the end of the Gita, where Sanjaya alludes to this also, when he says it in 1876. He says, "O king, recalling again and again this wonderful and sacred conversation between Keshava and Arjuna, I take pleasure and am thrilled at every moment." So yeah, as I say, 1 hour sessions will never do justice for the whole of the Gita. But with this in mind, our hope is to steer the discussions more toward the practical side of things, as well as trying to understand the flow and context of the particular verses. We find this, especially studying our own Guru Maharaj's commentary, for example, there is a particular logic as to why certain questions are asked at various times by Arjuna, for example, why Krishna brings certain points out at different times, and how he expands on points that he gave in more of a seed form, let's say, earlier in the Gita, how he expands on these things as he progresses through the Gita. And so we'll also study in that context as well, understanding the flow and the context, the logic of the Gita. But ultimately, we want to be able to have practical application of these timeless teachings for ourselves, because that sometimes our Guru Maharaj makes the point that sometimes these things can go in our heads, go in one ear out the other ear, and we may get so much information in our heads and these kind of things, but all these things we want to sink into our hearts so that we can make further progress. I know just from my own experience, or even having witnessed sometimes in devotees who are trying to practice, but sometimes can get a bit heady with some of the philosophy and like that, and can speak about a lot of different aspects of higher philosophy. But sometimes we forget the fundamentals, if you will, the fundamentals of sacrifice and so on. So the Gita really helps bring out a lot of these things that are, like I say, are relevant for everyone at every stage. And so hopefully we can serve also, no matter where you are on the path or where we are on the path and so on, to something of substance that can help us in our journey, if you will. And so part of this practical aspect is realizing three important attributes of who we are. And so we've all heard this, Satchit Ananda, right? That we exist. Is pointing out that we aren't seeking to become eternal, for example, that we already are eternal. And we also know that we can exist. We're conscious. We are conscious beings. And as our Guru Maharaj likes to point out, there's a purpose to that existence. It's not just existing. There's a purpose there, and we exist to joyfully love. So this is going to be our main focus, if you will, especially in terms of the commentaries in the school of Uttama Bhakti and so on. And I like to, when we started this study a few years ago, it was mainly for devotees who were very new to the Gita, actually. Some hadn't studied the Gita at all, although the group grew as it went on with devotees of different standings in the text, if you will. But for the purpose of our particular study and approach, when we started, and I think we'll also try to bring this into these studies too, there are four I found really important points we should consider, and we'll also refer back to throughout our journey of the Bhagavad-Gita. And I'll expand on them in a second, but in brief, the four points are that firstly, there's an all-inclusive nature of the Gita. That, like I say, the Gita is really about our the nature of being, and so anyone who is being, anyone who's existing, can derive something from the Gita. The Gita is really, although in one sense is spoken to Arjuna, like Krishna mentions later in the Gita, he speaks to Arjuna as his dear friend and devotee, and this is why he's revealing these secrets. But there were many, many other people on the battlefield and these kind of things, and we'll expand on that in a second. But yeah, so point number one being that the Gita is all inclusive, and then the second point that we'll expand on in a second is there's a certain way to approach the Gita also, and so we'll look into that, how we should approach the Gita. The third point is that the battlefield is within. Sometimes early on in our devotional lives, it's especially emphasized the literal aspect of it, and for good reason also, that Arjuna is really existing, Krishna is really existing, and these kind of things, and they are important points. But also there's so much there in the Gita that we can see how it applies, not just on that field of Kurukshetra, but on that field of Kurukshetra within, if you will, the battle that we all go through with our own minds and senses and so on. And then the fourth point, and I think it's a very important point, is that this is not an all or nothing affair. And I'll expand on that in a second also. But yeah, that wherever we are in our spiritual lives, we can derive so much from the Gita to help us make further progress and like that. And if we can't implement everything of the Gita all at once, we shouldn't think, okay, I may as well drop my bow now and walk away from the battlefield. No, we should still stick around on the battlefield. So yeah, the Gita is a text for all. And so I like to keep these 4 points in mind as we study. And so let's unpack them a little more as an introduction for the rest of the Gita. So the first point 1, like I mentioned, is that the Gita is all-inclusive. The nature of the text itself, of the conversation itself, is that it is all-inclusive. It's for everybody. Because like I say, that there are so many teachings that can be derived from the Bhagavad-Gita. Someone can approach it in an academic way. There are many ecological things that can be taken from ecological, religious. But I used to read one author years ago. I think his name was Stephen Pressfield, and he would speak a lot about the art of creativity, and I think there's the famous text that the art of war. He flipped that title and called it the War of Art, and there were nice things, points in there. But he also derived much from the Gita to apply to in that context too. So my point being that there are many things that can be and are derived from the Gita, many teachings that can be derived. So we can see the all-inclusive nature there. But of course, like I mentioned, our focus is on the experiential spiritual life that really the Gita is all about when we study it as a whole, and which is really what the Gita is advocating above everything else. And so I guess another important note in relation to that is that although there is a hierarchy even in the Gita of different spiritual practices, and there are different spiritual practices that can be found in the Gita, none of the doctrines that are given there, none of the practices that are given there are really condemned fully. I mean, there are some sections, let's take demigod worship and so on, where at one point in the Gita, Krishna speaks about it in a neutral way, really. And then, later he makes the point, and for good reason, we'll see when we get there, that it's for the less intelligent, if you will. But nothing is like condemned as in like, this is, no one should do this and this kind of thing. But rather, what is more emphasized is what is it about that approach to transcendence, or approach to even material life, approach to the absolute? What is it about these different things that give them merit, and that is given is really assessed depending, like I say, to go back to what we said at the beginning, the degree of selfishness or selflessness that's contained there in that approach. And so that we find Krishna is bringing out again and again, to take Arjuna, or us really, from selfishness to selflessness, or self-centeredness, selflessness, or Krishna-centeredness, if you will. So although many spiritual practices are given there in the Gita, and for particular reasons, which of course we'll unpack as we get to those sections in the Gita, they shouldn't be dismissed completely. And we'll see even, especially in the first 6 chapters, how many aspects of all of them can be found in our own bhakti practice. And our own Guru Maharaj also makes this point that, all those things that we see that come out of those other practices, for example, in the first 6 chapters, we should find coming in ourselves too, as we make progress up the bhakti yoga ladder, if you will. So on a related note to that too, in terms of the all-inclusiveness, we should also understand that in our own particular community, the Gaudiya Vaishnav community, we have a particular practice, a particular approach, and a way of living in response to what the Gita brings out. And this, of course, has been mapped out from the conclusions of the Bhagavad Gita by the different saints and teachers in our particular school. Um, and there are different approaches to this, and some may be more beneficial or more efficacious than others, depending on our own spiritual standing, where we are, and so on. Some things may be better at a certain point than others. But although we do have our own particular approach to the different topics that Krishna brings out in the Gita, like I mentioned, the conclusions of the Gita really are universally applicable. It's not just for one particular group of people. So a Christian, for example, or a Muslim, or someone in another tradition could take the conclusions of the Gita and apply them to their own particular tradition and find their own experience greatly enhanced. Because we know, in terms of different paths and so on, they do often come packaged in a certain culture and these kind of things, and moral and ethical laws change in time, for example. Cultures change, circumstances change, but the underlying principles that are brought out in the Gita, that all these other things are supposed to serve, they're actually unchanging. And that's going to be our focus and our approach to the Gita. And so although there are different groups, and even groups within groups, as we can see even within Gaudiya Vaishnavism and so on, the message of the Gita is for everybody. Everybody experiences suffering, for example, in this world, whether we like to admit it or not. Everyone experiences happiness, and both of them come and go, as we find out in the second chapter. So the Gita gives a proper perspective on this, which ultimately is rooted in attachment to temporary things, something that's going to be explored thoroughly in upcoming verses. And so that's the human experience. We all have that experience. But we will, of course, put the main emphasis in our studies on the Gaudiya Vaishnava perspectives on the Gita, because that's where we want to go, of course. And so that brings us to the second point then, I guess, of how we should approach the Gita. Because what the Gita encourages us to do, really, like I say, it's not just philosophy for our minds and these kind of things, but it encourages us to explore our inner life, to explore the subjective side of our life by going within. Just as science, material science, seeks to explore the objective side of life, what goes on with matter, that can be debated, of course, but, it studies matter, all these things outside and how they interact and what that means. Why does this do that? Although the why question isn't always explored so thoroughly as opposed to the how, but it really seeks to look outside of us and come to a unified understanding of that, but it's quite difficult because ultimately we are subjective beings. But the Gita explore that side of ourselves, the subjective side of ourselves. And so one way we should approach the Gita is to treat this study as an internal scientific exploration, if you will, of your own experience of life. As we mentioned, it is particularly spoken to Arjuna, but Arjuna, we find in the Gita, he's not already certain in his understanding of life. He's very humble, Arjuna. He's not proud. And so, of course, we're not encouraged to accept everything blindly. And I hope even within these sessions, for example, we'll be comfortable in these sessions to honestly discuss any doubts we may have on concepts that come up in the Gita and so on. But it's also important that we shouldn't dismiss everything blindly either. The only requirement really is that we have a spirit of humility, an open heart, so to speak. And so there will be different devotees or individuals who may be hearing this. And some of us may be devotees of Krishna. We're already convinced, if you will, and we're trying to deepen our faith, deepen our relationship, deepen our surrender to him, and so on. But others may be coming to the Gita for the very first and may not have that same inner conviction in Krishna, for example. And I think it's important to point out that this is perfectly okay, that nobody is expected to force themselves to have a faith in something that they don't. But one nice way to approach the Gita, though, in the open-hearted spirit of these discussions, to derive as much as we can from them, wherever we stand in our own conviction, is that we look to be seekers of the truth, who sometimes is said, the Gita can serve to act as the voice of the inner wisdom of our soul. Or of the soul. Of course, as we know, or some of us may know, it's not just us in there in the heart, but the Paramatma or Krishna is there in the heart too. And so we, even if we may not have full conviction in Krishna at this stage, we can take the voice of the Gita as that inner wisdom. I know my own experience with the Gita, although I've studied it a few times now, and it's been part of my life for a while. And in many ways, Krishna is a foundation or a pillar of my life, as much as I'm trying to surrender to him in my own practice. I remember the first time I read the Gita, I did have my reservations, if you will. I'd come from a Christian background, and the thoughts of other kinds of gods and these kind of things. Although I felt a relationship with God, and I felt, I spoke to God internally in prayer and these kind of things. I felt a little reservation in terms of, accepting Krishna. And I always liked how Prabhupada points out there that, one can just try, I can't remember exactly how he phrases it in his introduction, but basically approach it as if Krishna is God, and so that's what I tried to do. I tried to put aside all the kind of cultural baggage of like Krishna, this, blue boy who I don't know so much about and these kind of things, or I guess the blue warrior or chariot driver there in the Gita, but rather that it was God, that God who I knew in my heart, was speaking, who I had some relationship with, that this was his wisdom being spoken. So one can approach it like that too, if that's where someone is. And then hopefully as we go through the Gita, Krishna by his own words anyway, will help deepen that conviction and help us see those things that we may not have conviction in anyway. But whatever one's current internal conviction is, we hope to approach these discussions in a way that is nourishing for all, and to discuss that deep wisdom that's contained there within. And so point number 3 is that a common misunderstanding about the Gita is that it's about war, because it's set on a battlefield. And so if we carefully study the text, we can see that the battle that is highlighted is our own daily battle, really, with our own mind and our own senses. And so Krishna points out that knowledge and devotion are very powerful, and he gives these as a method to kill those attachments that especially cause us to do things that aren't in our greatest interest. Actually, the Gita, and we'll explore this more in upcoming verses, but the Gita itself is not a violent text, although it might seem like that on a superficial level. But really, our Guru Maharaj, he wrote a nice article about this to point out, that it's really about non-violence to the greatest degree. This world, as we know, is a harsh place. Anyone can look around and see that it can be a very harsh place in many aspects. And even, we may be fortunate to live in a comfortable situation, especially those of us in the Western world and so on. But even our current comforts are a result of some kind of violence somewhere else in the world. And it's not to put us all on a guilt trip and these kind of things, but it is, if we're realistic about the world and how the world is, this material world, it's an unfortunate state of affairs in many ways through a certain lens. And so the Gita seeks to bring us to a higher understanding of reality, to come to a place of pure selflessness and to live in the world in that way. And so the Gita shows us how we can experience the divine, how we can experience God in even the ordinary actions of our everyday life. and help us to have a mystical experience in our own day-to-day life, even to experience great spiritual joy, and ultimately to develop non-violence in the truest sense of the term. There's a really nice article by Thomas Merton. So Thomas Merton, for those who aren't familiar, he's a Catholic monk, or was a Catholic monk, who very much appreciated the Bhagavad-Gita. And he said that it teaches us to live in awareness of an inner truth. And by following that inner truth, become free. And so I highly recommend reading what Thomas Merton wrote about Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad-Gita. There's a very nice article on the Harmonist, for example. And so I'll try to link to it on the notes on YouTube. But yeah, it's very, very nice, his insights into the Bhagavad-Gita there also. But the point I'm making is that it is about our internal life, so the battlefield is within. So that's point number 3. And then point number 4, this also very important, because like I was saying earlier about not getting on a guilt trip and these kind of things, it's very important to remember that this Bhagavad-Gita and all that's contained within it, it's not an all or nothing affair. Like, sure, ultimately, the conclusion is Krishna saying, just surrender to me completely, and like that. So in that sense, you can say it is an all or nothing affair. But of course, he doesn't just jump straight to that conclusion of the Gita. And so it is an important point to consider, and one we'll come back to again and again in our study. The Gita contains a yoga ladder, which requires gradual progress. And all of us will be practicing according to the level that is suitable for us. We find that, especially even in our own tradition and school of Uttama Bhakti, that there are stages in that. One isn't at the highest level of praying from day one, but we go through the stages of sadhana, and there are stages, there are rungs on the yoga ladder. So nothing should be forced. And as we'll see, although we should also push ourselves to try and make progress, also to fight, if you will, to pick up our bow. But as we'll see later on in the Gita, Krishna himself also advocates different types of practice. So many of you will be familiar with verses 12:8 to 12:12, which I'll read now just because it may be some time before we get there in our own study. But he says there, just fix your mind upon me, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and engage all your intelligence in me. Thus you will live in me always, without a doubt. My dear Arjuna, O winner of wealth, if you cannot fix your mind upon me without deviation, then try to attain me by discipline in practice. In this way, develop a desire to attain me. If you cannot practice the regulations of Bhakti Yoga, then just try to work for me, because by working for me, you will come to the perfect stage. Merely by acting for my sake, you will attain perfection. If, however, you're unable to work in this consciousness of me, then try to act, giving up all results of your work, and try to be self-situated. If you cannot take to this practice, then engage yourself in the cultivation of knowledge. Better than knowledge, however, is meditation. From meditation comes renunciation of the fruit of action, from which peace quickly follows. So, like I say, it's not an all or nothing affair. We see there Krishna give different possibilities, if you will, according to where we are. And then even in the concluding verses of the Gita, for example, in 1863, Krishna, he says there to do as you wish after proper reflection to Arjuna, so I've given you all this, I've spoken all this. Now, consider it, contemplate it, but do as you wish, you have free will, you have independence, so do as you would like to do, but be armed with knowledge at least. So these studies are there to help us give proper reflection over the instructions of the Gita, and hopefully help us be honest with ourselves as to where we are, and to make progress in a higher direction. Because of course, pure selflessness to the highest degree, pure selflessness is a very high ideal. And there's a big spectrum in between. Very few, I'm sure, in this world can claim to be at the stage of pure selflessness to the fullest degree. And there is a big spectrum in between, and that's a wonderful thing because it gives us opportunity to walk in that direction. You know, as Srila Sridhar Maharaj makes the point that we judge by the ideal of someone, right? So if we make our ideal in that direction, that's a wonderful thing, even if we might not be there on the spectrum. You know, at the higher end, we're at the lower end, if you will. So we do have to live in this world, and we have to in harmony with material nature and spiritual nature to make healthy progress towards higher ideals. So the Gita isn't meant to make us neurotic, for example. It's not meant to give us knowledge of the higher goals and then expect that we jump there right away, even while we know honestly, internally, in our own practical reality, that we do have other interests as well in this world. And so the Gita helps us harmonize these things and take those gradual steps. And it's good to know the full path of the Gita. And the Gita gives us this full path. It's good to have this map. You know, it's good to know these things even theoretically also. Although, like I say, we don't want it to just stay theoretically, theoretical rather. You know, we do have to have a map in the first place. It lets us know internally where we are on the map and how to get where we want to go. But as our Guru Maharaj often warns, we should also be careful not to fool ourselves that because we've got some knowledge of some of these things, that we've attained it fully. And so that's the Gita really encourages us to approach it in that way, in an honest way, to you know, to be self-reflective and so on. And the real test is our honest detachment internally from material things or selfish desires, prestige, etc., and how much we really do have attachment to the spiritual. Because even those who have been around a while may have heard so many high things in the realm of transcendence. You know, we know the higher goals, we want them even. I'm sure, you know, we're not kidding ourselves when we think that we have some desire for them. And we also know that we should want them. But like I say, if most of us are honest, so many other things do occupy our consciousness on a day-to-day basis. And so, you know, we can't like repress those things like we just moved into the ashram on day one. Okay, I've given up the world. I don't need anything else in this world. You know, if we're honest, those things bubbling there, and we really do want these other things, no matter how much we know theoretically that they're not worth pursuing, and no matter how much we respect the people who are telling us that they're not worth pursuing. But like I say, the Gita, when properly studied, doesn't dismiss us. It doesn't say, well, you're a lost cause then, and these kind of things. It gives us a method to approach these higher ideals in a healthy and balanced way, even tailoring them so that they may become causes of our spiritual advancement. You know, like the Bhagavad-Gita makes the point of using a thorn to uproot a thorn that's stuck in our skin, for example. So, and so this is very optimistic. It's very encouraging. And the Gita is very encouraging in this way. And especially when we add also the practices of bhakti directly, like, for example, adding the chanting of Hare Krishna in our daily lives, the Maha Mantra in our daily lives, and so on. And association with the Vaishnavas and you know, all these different practices, then we can make gradual progression, even while we might consider ourselves leaning more towards the selfish side of the spectrum than the fully selfless side. So those are 4 points that are really important to keep in mind as we study the Gita and study these various topics, because Krishna will speak about all ends of the spectrum at different points in the Gita. And it's important to know that there are both low ends and high ends, and that we do need to make gradual steps in between, being honest with ourselves and our own needs for balance and harmony, and then act accordingly with our eyes fixed upwards. And so the Gita is very practical. also in this way. Like we mentioned, it talks about the nature of existence, the nature of what it means to exist as an entity, as we do. And it speaks about that nature, the nature of our being, in a way that it leads to, as our Guru Maharaj sometimes expresses it, like a theological thinking. You can say that, there's much in the Gita that we can practically experience right now. If we apply some of these things in the Gita, or we reflect on the world around us, we can apply right now. But it leads us to this theological thinking, this way of thinking, maybe believing thing that isn't there necessarily right there in front of our eyes. It's not there immediately at our disposal to experience. Because we can, like I say, we can experience much of it. We can experience ourselves to some extent. And the Gita is pushing us in that direction, to experience ourselves in a really deep sense. Like I mentioned, as a unit of being, of knowing, of loving, this Satchit Ananda that comes up often. And the Gita is very, when we hear these things and we look around, we contemplate like that, we start to think that, yeah, actually, I can see this is talking about me. It's quite clear, actually. It's talking about me. It's talking about the world, the way the world really is. If I look beneath the cover, beyond the social media, the shiny, happy, smiley faces that, and so on, if I look beneath the cover of how things really are, and like that, the Gita, I can see that. The Gita speaks how things really are. It speaks to us about things that are right there before our eyes that maybe we couldn't always see. So it opens our eyes to things. It helps us look at the world from another angle, and then start to see, yes, that's the way that things really are. So it's very confirming in this way. It doesn't just speak about something that you should believe in. It's not just about something you should believe in. And you will experience this after death. But you have to wait until you die before you experience it. There's much there that we can experience in our day-to-day. And by speaking about the nature of being, we can start to see right now, this is the way that things seem to work in the world, if I look a little more deeply. So it's a very, very profound text in that way, and very practical text. And like I say, then it encourages us and cultivates in us a belief in the other things that it speaks about, because it does also speak about not only what we're like, what we are and so on, and what we're like in our fullest potential, as a full lover of God. But that's the main point, that as we go deeper into the Gita, especially the middle 6 chapters, although Krishna also brings it up briefly in the 4th chapter, God comes into the picture, Krishna comes into the picture as God, and so on. And so ultimately, that's what the Gita is about what we are as lovers and servants of God, really. And ultimately, the Gita encourages sacrifice. And so our Guru Maharaj, he likes to point out that sacrifice is the womb from which love arises. And that's what we're all seeking after, really, in this world, directly or indirectly, is love. And so obviously opposed to that is attachment. Opposed to sacrifice is attachment. And so Krishna makes that point in the Gita, that attachment is the womb from which suffering is born. Deal with both our suffering, but also, what we really want, or what we want to be attached to, if you will, which is love. And so it speaks about love in the highest degree. And by doing so, or in pursuit of that, it encourages sacrifice. So sacrifice is a major theme of the Gita. So it's worth our while to go really deep into the Gita, because we can just say, okay, yes, it's about sacrifice, and then we'll all have our conceptions of what sacrifice means and so on. But the Gita will make a lot of these things very clear, and actually, like I say, provide a very clear map in many ways, especially with the help of our acharyas and so on. as to how to apply these things in our lives, that we can become sacrifices in the fullest sense, if you will. So it's worth our while to go deep into the Gita and continue to build that platform or that stage of Sharanagati, of surrender, which we've discussed at different times, on which the play of Krishna Lila takes place. Our Guru Maharaj puts it like that. I don't know if it's still the tagline, but the tagline for this Tattva Vivek series, something along those lines, the canvas on which the art of Krishna Lila can be drawn. So that Sharanagati has to be in place, that stage of Sharanagati has to be erected. And so, the Gita is worth our while to go deep into the Gita, because the Gita is really all about that, helping us build that stage and these kind of things, so that we can come to the stage of pure selflessness, if you will, where prema is really there, what prema is really about, pure love. And so, moving forward, as I say, in the future sessions, we're going to draw very heavily from our Acharya's commentaries, although I might be the one speaking predominantly, although hopefully there'll be other input as devotees are able to join live and so on. But really, we'll be drawing mainly from our Acharya's commentaries, because it'll be a continuing study for myself also, especially looking at the logical flow of the conversation, as is often pointed out by our Guru Maharaj in his commentary. And so for the most part, I'll be repeating the commentaries, but in a synthesized way, to try to avoid repetition and so on. Naturally, I may also share some of the things myself or others in our other study sessions locally have brought out while studying, because again, there's so much in the Gita. And I also encourage you to bring your own realizations and own practical applications as we make progress. Because, the text is ever deep. And we'll never personally be able to cover everything in one session. And I'm sure all of you have so many things you can share on the Gita also, in your own experiences of the Gita and understandings and way we can apply these things. So ideally, you can share your thoughts live in session if you can make it, but I know that's not always possible. I'm not always able to make the live sessions. So if that's not possible, maybe you can comment on the YouTube videos, and then I can share those comments in the next session as an introduction and summary as we enter the next verses, if you will. And so I'm going to wrap up now in a second, but just to let you know that generally, each session, we will spend each session on 2 to 4 verses, depending on the natural flow of the Gita. Some it may make sense to spend, a session on 2 verses. Some it may make sense to spend a session on 5 verses, and so on. And we'll see how it makes sense. Sometimes even we might spend a number of sessions on just one verse to get a really thorough understanding. For example, when we studied the verse 434, which speaks about approaching the Guru, because Guru Tattva is such an important topic and relevant topic for so many, and there's a lot of confusion on it. I think we spent like 7 or 8 sessions on that verse alone locally. So we'll see how it plays out as we make progress in these sessions. But next time, though, we will look at a big chunk. It won't always be like this. It'll slow right down as we get to the second chapter. But next time we'll look at verses 1 to 10. But we will still split these up. Like I say, we won't just do the whole first chapter in one batch, because although sometimes they're taken as introductory verses, they're said to be setting the scene for the conversation of the Gita to take place. As we'll see next time, there's a lot to be found in the first chapter, and actually even in the very first verse. And so, we'll save that for next time. But there's a lot in the first chapter that we can derive from. And so, with that, I guess I'll be quiet and open up if there's any. I guess it's just Braj on the call at the moment, but I'll just take a look on the YouTube. But otherwise, we'll wrap up and then we'll carry on next time with the verses 1 to 10. Okay, so no problem. So we'll so we'll get together, I think even next month or the month after to start on verses 1 to 10. But of course, there's so much going on before that. So obviously, there's the Polish retreat is taking place. I think the first program start tomorrow. So there are going to be many classes. I think Guru Nishta posted a poster with the different times of classes of Guru Maharaj. So so keep your eyes open for that. There's going to be, I'm sure, a lot of nice nectar coming out of Poland. And yeah, and obviously the Tattva Vivek will continue also along the way. So yeah, thank you for being here now or in the future. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo